join me in an exciting conversation with Paul Kiparsky. Paul Kiparsky is a professor in linguistics from Stanford University. He's an expert in Panini and Sanskrit, Panini and linguistics. And in this interview, in this podcast, I talked to him about many things related to Sanskrit. Nothing very technical, but we touch upon Sanskrit, the language itself, Panini's contribution to it, and how Paul got interested in Sanskrit. And this is one of the best interviews I ever had. Paul comes to me with highly recommended for this topic. I reached out to Noam Chomsky. Some of you know Noam Chomsky is a legend. He's a prodigy in linguistics. And I asked him if he would talk to me on Panini and Sanskrit. Noam said that Paul would be the right candidate, right person to talk to on Panini and Sanskrit. And Paul kindly accepted my invitation. So let's dive in and speak to Paul Kiparsky on Sanskrit, Panini, and linguistics.
So Paul, thanks for being with us. We're going to talk about briefly three things. One is the Sanskrit language itself, and then Panini's contribution to linguistics, to the language, to the science of language, and then how you got interested in him. So tell us a little bit about the language of Sanskrit. We know it's very old. We know it's originated from the Indian subcontinent, and Indians feel that it is the mother of major languages. What's your take on the language itself?
Yeah, it's certainly the mother of a whole family of languages, the Indo-Aryan languages, which include Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, and so on. Not all the languages of India are included in that family. There's another major family, the Dravidian languages, which have been influenced a lot by the Indo-Aryan languages and vice versa. And the language which is more or less the ancestor of the Indo-Aryan languages is Sanskrit. And it survives in different forms from different periods. There's Vedic, the oldest form. The Rig Veda is the oldest document in Sanskrit, and it must be at least from 1000 BC, and perhaps older. It was transmitted all this time orally. It was, of course, also written down, but it was essentially taught to students from one generation to another by oral transmission. And there were several other Vedas, which we also have. And Panini describes a state of language which is a bit more recent. People date him to 500 BC or 350 BC or somewhere in between. And Sanskrit was a language at that time which was still in vernacular use. But already Prakrits were spoken at the same time. For example, the Buddha spoke some form of Middle Indic. So there was a situation in which Sanskrit was a kind of high form, just like classical Arabic today, whereas there were vernaculars, just like the Arabic vernaculars today. This is called diglossia, the coexistence of different high and low forms of the same language.
Like dharma in Sanskrit becomes dhamma in the Pali language, right? So that arma becomes ma. So and then the bhikshu becomes bhikkhu in this language. So it's that is what you're probably referring to.
Yes, sutra becomes sutta, and so on.
Yeah.
So dharma pravachana sutram is Dhamma Pavatana Suttam or something like that.
Suttam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Panini is already much older than classical Sanskrit. For example, Panini spoke a language that had accent in different places of the word, depending on what the pieces of the word were. And that was all lost by the time we get to classical Sanskrit literature.
What's a classical Sanskrit?
Classical Sanskrit is the language of the great Sanskrit literature, Kalidasa, and poetry like Bhartrhari's poetry and so on.
Yeah.
So that is a language that continued to be used. The literary Sanskrit continued to be used for literary productions even into modern times. So it is a scientific language. So I was in Pune. There were pundits from different parts of India, some from South India who spoke Dravidian languages, and some from Maharashtra who spoke Marathi, and maybe a few Bengali speakers. And they actually, none of them spoke English, but they spoke Sanskrit together. This was their medium of communication, even for completely secular and everyday topics like when does the bus leave, they would use Sanskrit.
Was it recent? Was it recently?
It was just, this was in, my first trip was in 69, and then I went again 76, 77, and this is what the pundits did, and they were of all ages.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how you got. I'll get to the Sanskrit and the Paninian grammar, but I got more interested in your journey with the language, with the Panini or the Sanskrit. Tell me a little bit about how you got interested into it. When was the first time you got exposed to this language?
I had an interest in historical linguistics and Indo-European in particular, so I studied it from that point of view as a graduate student. I would go to Harvard, and we used to read, for example, Rig Veda in the course that was offered by Daniel Ingalls, who was a very famous Sanskritist. But I then got hired at MIT, where I also had studied. And
when was this?
Well, I graduated in 65 and was hired that year. And a couple of years later, a Dutch philosopher and Sanskritist, Frits Staal, spent a year at MIT, and he gave a course on Panini. And that turned me around. I decided I wanted to spend my next sabbatical, which was 68, 69, in India, learning more about Panini.
With the traditional scholars?
Yes, I first went to Benares, but I didn't hit it off with the pundits there. I then went to Pune. That was very good advice. It was suggested to me by Jeffrey Mason, who at that time was a Sanskritist. And he introduced me to a very great scholar, Shivram Joshi, who was a legend already. He was very young still at the time, but had already done amazing things. And we hit it off immediately. So, in fact, we had lunch, and he proposed, "You teach me Chomsky, and I'll teach you Panini." And that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
That's amazing.
Lifelong collaboration as well.
That's amazing. So you learn Panini and so Panini in Sanskrit is basically Ashtadhyayi, Shiva Sutras, and the Dhatu Pata.
Anapatas also, so there's really four components. There's the Ashtadhyayi, and then there is the Dhatu Pata, which is a list of roots organized in the right way so that you can pick out classes. And then there's a list of noun classes as well. And the Shiva Sutras then are a classification of sounds, a list, again, organized of the phonemes of Sanskrit.
This is pretty exciting. So what happened after that? You came back to US after spending some time with Joshi?
Yeah, I came back, and then Joshi came to America for a year. And then I went back to India again, following sabbatical, and we've worked together on a number of projects. And we had this idea that we would try to understand the system behind the Ashtadhyayi from the ground up, because we realized that there was a discontinuity in the oral tradition. So even the earliest commentators, that's Patanjali and Katyayana, are not quite certain about what Panini's intention was in this or that rule, and they debate what this rule actually should mean, or how the grammar should be understood and organized and so on. And we decided to just decode the system from the ground up. And we've found amazing things, I think. So the first thing I found is that there's much more information in the grammar than the tradition actually understands there to be. So I found that there are 3 words used to designate that a rule is optional, can either apply or not. One is va, the second is vibhasha, and the third is anyatarasyam. And I found that they're all different in what they mean. Va means preferably, vibhasha means marginally, and anyatarasyam means either way.
This is about usage of the particular rule.
Usage, yes, yes. Yeah. So I investigated, I mean, there's thousands of rules to which this actually applies, because many rules fall under such a heading, which goes a long way. So I found it matches both the usage of Sanskrit, statistically, the preferred options are always the most common, and it matches Vedic, where we actually can count the same text that Panini was looking at, and it matches the usage of the Ashtadhyayi itself. Panini himself always used the Va variant if there is an option. So that showed that there's more to be discovered there. So
even more to be discovered by the future linguists,
right?
Somebody like you, yeah.
So and that's a project that still goes on, and it's been continued by other people as well.
Yeah. So there was a recent, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Rishabh, I forget his last name, from UK, Cambridge University. He was all over the
Raj
Popat. Rishi Raj Popat. So he got into news, he got into some hot waters with all the pundits in India. And what's your take on that?
I think it's a very interesting idea. There are problems with it, but it also solves a lot of problems.
So tell me a little bit about what was the thing that he was talking. I know he's talking about the meta rules that Katyayana and then how they interpreted Paninian rules, right? Is that so?
It's
Tell me a little bit.
Yes, it's actually about what para means. So Panini has the rule vipratishyate param karyam. When you have a conflict between two rules, the latter rule, the one that is enumerated after the other, is the one that prevails. According to Rajeev Kurapati, the correct interpretation is when you have a conflict, the rule that applies in the rightmost environment, in the context that is to the right, prevails. And that is something, it doesn't work always, but it certainly solves, if it's correct, it would solve a whole lot of problems, as well as creating a few that weren't problems before.
Yeah, so it's what from my limited knowledge in Sanskrit, what I understood was it worked in the examples he has given, maybe 30 or 20 examples he has given, but the pundits were asking, give us 100,000 examples and tell us if it works and how many are not. So that,
yeah, I've been working through all the examples and also looking at cases that he doesn't deal with. And I have a list of problems which I will send him, and hopefully we can get to the bottom of this. I look forward to discussing it with him very soon.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So you spend some time, Joshi spent some time with you in the US and you continued that project. That's wonderful. So now coming back to the Sanskrit itself, one fundamental question that comes from time to time is why, if Sanskrit is so beautiful, they call it Deva Bhasha, the language of gods. If it is so beautiful, why is it almost extinct? Why among normal colloquial usage? I know pundits talk, I know linguists speak in Sanskrit, but is it because it's difficult, or is it because it was monopolized by a certain group? What do you think?
It's because every language is always changing. There's no language that remains stable, even over 100 years. The English that is spoken now is different from the English that was spoken even 50 years ago. So within my lifetime, it has changed in many ways. And within 1,000 years, even more. So Old English is now incomprehensible to a modern speaker of English. And what happened is that in a literary language, the power of the literature, the influence of that literature can freeze a language in a certain state. So we can read Latin poetry and Latin text today. We can read Sanskrit text today, but we have to learn the language, and very few people achieve oral knowledge of dead languages.
Yeah, Sanskrit. I don't know about other languages. I know Indian languages. I know 3 to 4 Indian languages. I don't know German or Mandarin or other languages. What do you think is the difference between older languages like Chinese, like Mandarin, maybe German? I don't know how old it is compared to Sanskrit. You pick 2 or 3 different languages and tell us what difference do you see between Sanskrit and the others?
Well, there's a question what it means to say that a language is old. Since a language is always changing, every language is equally old. That is, it has been there forever since since Homo sapiens started to be able to speak. There has been language, and we don't know whether all languages are ultimately descended from one single language or not, but Chinese is another classical language that has broken up into a number of vernaculars. So a Cantonese speaker doesn't use the same language as a Beijing speaker, and there are local dialects which are even more different than those, and there are related languages which go back to an ancestor language. And as a matter of fact, English and Sanskrit go back to a single language. We know that, and that's called Indo-European. And the discovery of that relationship is more than 200 years old. It was first discovered by Sir William Jones, who was a colonial official in Calcutta, who studied Sanskrit with a Pandit and started noticing similarities of Sanskrit to Greek and Latin, which he knew very well, and conjectured on the basis of that they were once the same language, not just that they were similar, but they once had been identical and had descended from a common ancestor.
You know, the William Jones thing. So some of the contemporary historians, they, especially the Indic historians, or they don't agree with William Jones. They feel that it was his hypothesis that Sanskrit was part of a family and it is not really independent, but it was a part of the family of languages, and it's no superior to the others. But these contemporary historians feel that it was something that William Jones concocted, William Jones hypothesized, and now that is, they don't agree with that. With that William Jones's hypothesis that it belonged to an Indo-European language and they had the same roots. They say that Sanskrit was the primordial language from where the Latin and other European languages originated or had roots in.
Well, there's actually no doubt about that. You won't find the linguist who will agree with that. But it's a very natural sentiment. So there were, around the same time or a century or two earlier, there was a Dutch linguist who said that all languages originate from Dutch, which is the language of Holland. And there was even a patriotic Finnish linguist, I come from Finland, who said that Finnish is the mother tongue. So this is something that you might say if you were very proud of your culture and your language, but there's no scientific basis for it at all.
Yeah. So coming back to the classical Sanskrit, so the Sanskrit before Panini, was it, there is a Vedic language, and then there is a Vedic Sanskrit, and there is a classical Sanskrit? Was that how it worked at the time?
Yes, and Panini is in between Vedic and classical. So he is roughly contemporary with the Brahmanas, or the older Upanishads. And that is the language of Vedic prose, not Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, and so on, but Shatapatha Brahmana, for example. They have a system that is very similar to Panini's and in many ways matches exactly the rules of Panini's grammar.
Yeah. I studied some of the Panini and Astadhyayi sutras, and there are very tight, highly packed, compact sutras, and there are 4,000 of them. Do you think Panini is the greatest linguist ever lived?
Well, he is the greatest grammarian who ever lived.
What is the grammarian? What's a linguist?
Well, a grammarian is someone who figures out the way a language works. So he's unrivaled in his skill of working out the regularities, the generalizations of the language, and expressing them in the most illuminating and compact fashion. He did not ask the kinds of theoretical questions that linguists for the last 200 years have asked. So he did not ask about origins of Sanskrit or about the relationship of Sanskrit to other languages, or even understand, as far as we know, that languages evolve. So for him, Vedic and his own language and Prakrit, which were all available to him and which he knew about, were just so many different versions of a continuum, let's say. They were not different evolutionary stages of the language, the way we now understand. So he didn't know about language change. He did not ask about language typology, which modern linguists are interested in. What are the limits of variation between languages? Why is it that languages are, in their broad properties, so similar to each other and yet vary so much?
What's the language typology?
Well, for example, the difference between Chinese and Sanskrit is that Chinese has essentially monosyllabic constituents. The minimum, characters in the written language and syllables in the spoken language all are meaningful, and there are no long unanalyzable words, or very few.
Okay.
So we have plenty of polysyllabic words in English, and for that matter in Sanskrit. So lotus is Kamala, but we can't piece that together into Ka, Ma, La. It's just simply one word with 3 syllables. Chinese doesn't have that. And Chinese doesn't have a lot of suffixes. For example, to make genitive or ablative or locative case or whatever in Sanskrit, you add an ending to a word. Chinese doesn't have those. And then another difference is that some languages hang a lot of endings tidily one after the other, like beads on a string, while Sanskrit, and this is Panini's discovery, puts them together and then applies various kinds of sandhi rules to glom them together. And it's only by analysis that you can break up, for example, a noun into a stem, a pratipadika, and a suffix pratyaya. And that is not something that Western linguists knew how to do until they discovered Panini. They didn't know how to analyze Latin and Greek, which they were very much concerned with by this Paninian method.
Interesting. So you look at the words in Sanskrit. For example, take a word like khaga, which means a bird. And you break it up, you get ka and ga gachati. Ka means sky, that which goes in the sky is that object, and which is a bird. So when you look at English, you take the word bird, there is no breaking it up and analyzing and giving it a meaning. You just associated a word with an object, right? So in Sanskrit, you break the word up and it's almost like it's descriptive, describing the person or the characteristics of that object, for instance, in this case, bird. So tell us about how, did Panini discover this, or tell me a little bit about this kind of breakup between Sanskrit and other languages.
Well, Panini discovered the right way of understanding this. In some sense, people always had an intuitive idea that words sometimes have small, meaningful parts. But let's go back to the noun inflection. So in Sanskrit, you have a word, I don't know, shabda, which means word, or so you can form different case forms, shabde, shabda, and so on, depending on what the syntax, what the word.
Shabdaihi, shabdanam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the way in which that was treated until linguists learned about the Sanskrit grammarians and Panini's method was to say that you start with the nominative, shabda, let's say, or the Latin equivalent, let's say, verbum, and you do stuff to the ending. You manipulate, you do an operation of some sort to the ending. So verbum to make the plural, verba to make verbi, verbo, etc. And they did not have this idea of decomposing the word into a stem and an ending. And once that idea came to their attention, they did apply it to the analysis of Latin and Greek, and that led to this tremendous discovery of the relationship between the Indo-European languages that we were talking about a while ago. Namely, it's those pieces that you can systematically compare and discover to be historically related. Once, if you look just at the whole word, there's not much you can do. But if you look at the morphemes, as they're called, the parts of the words, the pieces, the relationships between the languages become very clear and uncontrovertible. So this is then the answer to the pundits who doubt the relationship of Sanskrit to other languages. And they should just look at all of that and they will convince themselves that Sanskrit.
So you see this kind of root word and adding suffixes, prefixes to it and building up, it's almost taking Legos and build up, it's building up. So you see that kind of thing in Sanskrit, we know. You see that in Latin also, Latin and other.
You see that in Latin and of course even in English. If you look at more complicated words, you can decompose those. I mean, you can take king and you can make kingdom or kingship. Or you can take even longer words, famously anti-disestablishmentarianism. Okay, famous long word. Well, anti-disestablishment, Aryanism, those are all pieces.
Okay, that makes sense. So, whereas in Sanskrit, you can go all the way to just monosyllable dhatus, like ka, like trich, or like much, those type of dhatus, and then start building it up all the way down to, I don't know how to describe it. Is it monosyllable or just single, very, very basic word, like. That's one thing. The second thing that I've noticed is, for example, you take brahmana, and then you can actually give a definition to the word. For example, you take king. You can define king, or you can define a king. I mean, he's a ruler of the word, but you cannot go to the word and break it apart and say, this is what the word actually means, right? So Brahma means a brew. From brew means to expand. So that is because it is expansive, you call Brahman. That is why the word Brahman came, because it comes from, or it denotes Bhru, which is to expand. You take an example of a king. I can't find anything in the king that describes what a king does.
Yeah. So I think it's useful to distinguish between the origins of words and this analysis into pieces. Many times you can give what's called an etymology. That is, you can give a derivation from an earlier ancestral state. But
maybe if you go to the Latin word of that, you will find something similar, right?
Yeah. So, for example, according to one theory, Brahman and Latin flamen, which is priest, are related.
Mm-hmm.
That's an etymology, and it's not 100% certain, but it's a very suggestive relationship because the words correspond in just the way you would expect if you look at the relationship between Latin sounds and the cognate Sanskrit sounds.
Yeah, that's great. So what else did Panini do? What was his contribution? So he took the existing language, he critically examined how did he even approach it? How do you look at a language and say, this is how the language works? What kind of mind does it take? It's like looking at the universe and saying, this is how the universe works, right?
Well, he didn't start completely from scratch. There had been an earlier tradition.
Grammarians, yeah.
Well, they were kind of grammarians, but they were concerned with a particular Veda. And so there was an issue of how you were to pronounce the words when you cited them.
Siksha, yeah.
Shiksha and also pratishakyas.
Pratishakya, yeah.
So
Niruttam Pratishakya.
they constructed word by word text from the running text that was divinely revealed
in the Vedas. Yeah.
In the Veda, they constructed the counterpart in which the words were separated. So, for example, I don't know, Ganapatim. That's a compound. They would say Ganapatimiti Ganapatim. That was a way in which you could identify the parts of a compound word. And they constructed various permutations like Kramapata and so on, by which you could recite the words in different combinations. Yeah. And then they constructed a system of rules, that's the Pratishakya, which takes the isolated words and combines them so that you get the original text.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, this really, it takes a human artifact, the Padapata, and converts it into a divine object. So that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that's amazing. So,
so
Vedas were, yeah.
Yeah, so Panini did this for the whole language. The same thing for the entire Sanskrit language. That was a massive, massive step. And for that, he needed a very, very rich apparatus. And it's only because of that very rich and interesting theoretical apparatus that he was able to compress the entire Sanskrit language into 4,000 rules, each one very short, as you said. There's about 10,000 actual words in the Ashtadhyayi.
Yeah, that's the brevity. That's extraordinarily brevity.
Yeah, and the thing is, the brevity forces the generalizations to emerge, because every time you discover a principle or a rule, that then all of the cases that it covers don't have to be anymore enumerated.
Yep.
And just have one rule. And so the brevity forces insight.
Why was he obsessed with brevity? I mean, I see when we studied Astadhyaya, every half matra was important for Panini. You know, why was he obsessed with it?
Well, you could turn it around and say, because brevity reveals so much that is important and interesting, let's stick with that principle and see where it takes us. And that's, by the way, something that has come back independently of Panini in modern science. There is a branch of mathematics and a theory of induction even, which says that that's how we build theories and also how we learn to understand the world. It's called minimum description length.
Minimum description language?
Minimum description length.
Length. Oh, nice. Okay.
That is a principle. It goes back to the Russian mathematician Kolmogorov, who was, by the way, also interested in language. And it has roots in the theory of randomness and so on. So
was he influenced by Panini at some point? Was he exposed to Panini?
No, that was Mendeleev, the discoverer of the
periodic table.
Yeah, of the periodic system. So he looked at Panini's organization of sounds, the Shiva Sutras, and which are a periodic system, right? Because you have the
right.
After 8 or 6 sounds, you know, you have
swara and the vyanjana and then the kind of based on the origin of the word, is that origin of the letter in the mouth and the throat.
So that's why you find that Mendeleev called the predicted elements of his system that he hadn't yet found, that were in some cases found later, he gave them Sanskrit names.
Very interesting.
So, you know, I think it was dvi-aluminium or three, I don't know. He used the Sanskrit numerals the way other scientists used Greek and Latin. And I think that's homage to Panini, because he actually knew about Panini from a colleague at the Russian Academy who was a Panini scholar and put together the first Western edition and translation of Panini's work.
That's extraordinary. I've never heard about that. I know that the tradition goes that, you know, Mendeleev woke up from a dream and said, I dreamt these, these elements, and then he, if I'm not mistaken, he saw he visualized the entire periodic table in his dream, whatever he saw, and then started writing it down.
Well, it's possible, but I'm not claiming that he was influenced by Panini, but I am claiming that he saw the similarity of his discovery and Panini's discovery, and wanted to honor Panini by his terminology. So I think he may well have figured it out on his own. I think he probably did figure it out on his own without being inspired by Panini or anything. And it came out of his attempt to develop a theory of possible combinations of elements. You know, what's a possible substance, in other words? That interesting question. So he had a kind of generative grammar of chemistry.
Yeah. Back to the science of grammar by Panini. Some say that the language of computers is analogous or similar to how Panini described it, the kind of sutras, the brevity of it. The language of computation was similar to it or was derived from it.
I don't believe that at all. Well, they're both short, but
yeah, they have similarities on the brevity part or the building up part.
Yeah, but there's no organic similarity or relationship between computing languages and Panini's grammar, which is not to say that you couldn't develop a parser, for example, using insights from Panini, and that's a research project that is going on in India. There are people in Hyderabad and Mumbai who are actually doing that. So it is a valuable contribution to the understanding of how the language works. And for natural language processing, that is very precious. Yeah. But the computing languages came quite independently from other sources and had nothing to do with Panini.
Yeah. So you look at Sanskrit, most of Indians, people who are living in India, most of them don't even know about Panini. So people who are like in their 40s, who are just got interested in the language and they go back and start looking and learning, except the pundits or the Sanskrit, the pundits who are learning the Vedas and the Sanskrit and the language itself, very few, I don't know if you count, it may be 5% or less in India are actually familiar with this legend Panini. They know more about Einstein, Newton, and others, but not so much about Panini. Is it because sciences have, from the fine arts? I'll let you comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a scandal, and there should be statues to him. There is a postage stamp with his image on it. We, of course, don't actually know what he looked like, but he does have a stamp. So I don't know why he isn't honored more, and it certainly has to do with the fact that linguistics isn't honored more among the sciences, and perhaps there are ideological reasons. I have no idea.
Yeah, and political, ideological reasons why he's not honored. But then if you look at what his contribution to the science of linguistics, not just Sanskrit, just in general, the science of linguistics, it's amazing that one person, a single man, was able to influence the entire language for 2,500 years. Is just amazing. You can interpret his sutras differently, but then is he the monopoly? Is he the only person? Is that the only source for Sanskrit now?
Oh, no. I mean, we still have, from the Vedas on to the classical Sanskrit literature, we have lots more Sanskrit texts by an order of magnitude more than, for example, ancient Greek or Latin texts. There's an unbelievable amount of writings in not just dramas and Ramayana, Mahabharata, and different sciences other than linguistics, for example, astronomy, medicine, and so on. So Sanskrit is very well known that if you just want to learn it and take it and take that knowledge, you can
Technology for, yeah. So
yeah.
there's a lot more undiscovered, I think,
There's
so there's
literature that has never been published. Yes, there are manuscripts that are sitting in libraries and awaiting publication, for sure. And the ones that have been published, for the most part, have not been translated. So there's a lot of knowledge there.
yeah. And
Yeah.
no, go ahead.
Let's see what I was going to say that it's not exactly true that it's a one-man achievement. Panini himself cites a dozen or so earlier grammarians who differ on this and that point. So he was just the last and greatest in a long series of people. It would be actually, I think, completely impossible for a single person in a single lifetime to build anything like the Ashtadhyayi.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, Ashtadhyayi is, I feel that it should be at least it should be. I grew up in India. I was never exposed to anybody, this person named Panini, or there is a literature named Ashtadhyayi. Never exposed. So I mean, if I studied Sanskrit, you studied the declensions and a little bit of grammar and this and that, but never about Panini. And then I wanted to talk about the philosophy behind the Sanskrit language, which was touched upon by Bhartrhari. Bhartrhari talked about Vakya. He talked about, or he wrote this the small volume called Vakyapadiyam, where he talks about the philosophy behind the language, from where does the nada comes from, where does the spota, nada, and all those come from. Anything about Bhartrhari?
Well, that's a bit beyond my pay grade. I'm not a philosopher, and I think most of his ideas belong there, but he had some interesting ideas that resonate in modern psychology and philosophy as well. For example, the idea that language communication is inferential rather than just the transmission of a package that entirely expresses a thought. The idea that we understand language by let's say taking what is said and constructing an interpretation of it. So he gives the example of a child who is told, protect this porridge from crows. And he says, even a child will understand that if a dog comes, it should also protect it from the dog and not be so literal-minded. That is the idea that we communicate only explicitly only part of what we intend to convey. And that is actually a very powerful idea that has been developed by the philosopher Grice in modern pragmatics. That, for example, that, let's say, it's hot in here, could be a hidden request to open a window, right? So you can have quite some distance between what is said and what is understood. And so another idea that Bhartrhari has, and it's related to what you were mentioning, the spota and all of that, that you have a very active sense of expectation as you listen to what is said. So I think he gives the example Kamala. Says you hear the first syllable ka, and you're already anticipating what might come. You then hear the second syllable ma, and you have almost certainty now that what will come is la. And so that is actually something that we know is true, and we know it from psycholinguistic experiments. There is a constant, very alert, predictive activity going on from a listener. So,
very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, these kinds of ideas that were, I guess, more or less proposed in the vein of philosophy by Dr. Ali, have in some interesting cases an empirical side to them that has turned out to be correct.
Yeah, it looks like linguistics has multiple subspecialties, like the grammar, the morphology, or the philosophy behind it, the inference. I don't know how does it work in linguistics? Where do you stand?
Well, first of all, it has, as we already mentioned, it has historical and synchronic aspects. That is, we can look at language origins and how languages are grouped into families by common descent and how they influence each other over time. But we can also look at how they are organized and how they are learned. Mm-hmm. That is, in a way, the focus of much modern research. So we ask, how is it possible that with so little evidence, you learn to speak fluently and correctly? Let's say a 2-year-old can barely put 2 words together, and they won't be in a grammatical sentence. Whereas a couple of years later, they are talking like a blue streak, you know, they can tell you long stories, and you can see, let's say, from a 5-year-old's pronunciation, a few words will tell me whether they are from Boston or New York or Philadelphia just by listening to exactly what they pronounce. But they are also already starting to form quite complicated sentences. How does that happen? So far, there is no computer that can do that with so little evidence. Speech recognition now works with enormous amounts of data, big data, you know, massive amounts of text, and then it gets good. But children do that without that massive amount of text. You know, they hear language every day, of course, but when you add it all up and give that to a computer, you're not going to get the same understanding that a child achieves. So that is a question that relates to the question of how languages differ and to what are the limits on the difference. And the idea is that there is a built-in component. Our brains are already designed to receive language and to organize it in particular ways. So that solves 2 questions at once. One, what are the limits and why are they there? Because they're already built in. Secondly, how can we learn a language so easily? Because we are expecting, so to speak, what is to come, what the input will be like, and how it's to be organized.
Yeah, that's amazing. So,
and you were asking about the types of linguistics, phonology.
Yeah. Subdivisions. Yeah.
Study of sounds. Phonetics is first the production and perception of sound by itself. So let's say dhvani. in Sanskrit. Right. And then phonology is the organization of those sounds into significant units. So that would be more like spota, if you like.
Yeah.
Those terms. And then there is morphology, which is about the dhatus and pratyayas and so forth. Then there is syntax, which in Panini is done by karakas, for example, or lakaras and so on. So right. The abstract categories that are combined in certain ways. Yeah. And then there's semantics, which is about meaning. Those are the main branches of linguistics. And then there's, of course, also sociolinguistics. For example, what does language have to do with identity?
Identity, yeah.
Yes, because language, as again, we were talking about how important it is for these pundits that you were mentioning, how right. Sanskrit is as a marker of identity, or how it is for a speaker to signal their allegiance to a particular community by conforming to the norms. We don't have, so to speak, private languages. Language is always public and shared with others. And it's important to speak exactly like those other speakers.
Right. Right. It's a collective agreement, right? So we all agree on.
Exactly. It's a collective agreement. And in that respect, it's like fashion and a lot of other things. It signals your membership in a community.
Yeah. There is so much science in this language. I mean, in the word science, I think depends on how you use it. But I would say there's so much construction behind what goes behind the language. And you can see it, at least because I studied Sanskrit, I can see the construction, that the logic that goes behind the language. And it's very fascinating. So do you think that Sanskrit is becoming more popular because of the internet and because of how it's widely available, rather than sequestered into gurukulas and certain areas like Pune and Benares and things like that? Do you think it's becoming more and more open to people who are not from a certain background, or from a country or from a lineage?
Well, it's certainly more available. Whether people are taking advantage of that availability is something that I can't really address. I believe that in India, again, there are people who take up Sanskrit for cultural or political reasons. And I don't know much about that, but I wouldn't be surprised if the availability of Sanskrit is helping to make it more widely spread.
Yeah.
I don't see, though, that Sanskrit departments in universities are particularly thriving or becoming larger. Sanskrit is, for example, in my university, Stanford, you can take elementary Sanskrit, but you can't really do specialized research in Sanskrit.
Even at Stanford.
Even at Stanford. Berkeley is, I'm sorry to say, since I'm at Stanford, and Berkeley is kind of a rival of Stanford, it's partly a joking rivalry. Anyway, they have a very serious Sanskrit department.
Interesting. Yeah, there is this people, the contemporary Indic scholars saying, there are all these Sanskrit scholars in these Western universities who don't speak Sanskrit, who don't know much about Sanskrit, but they write about Sanskrit. But then they themselves do the same thing. They don't speak the language, they don't write, they don't learn, but then they talk about it. So I think Sanskrit is something that I found later in my life, I studied a little bit, but I picked it up in my late 30s, and continued to study and did a master's in it. But I only got exposed to Sanskrit. I am just good enough to appreciate the beauty of it. But somebody like you reading the articles that you've written, I think experts and legends like you continue to work on it.
But I think you're right that the Indian scholars are way ahead in dealing with classical Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Their weak spot and the strength of Western scholars is Vedic studies and grammar. So this is something that I think it's a division of labor, so to speak.
Yeah. And also the pronunciation, right? So you have to grow up with it. You have to be in an immersive experience with it. Even somebody who grew up in India, I can't use the swaras like the Vedic swaras. Like, so when you say the Purusha Sukta, Sahasra Sirusha, Purusha Sahasraksha, Sahasrapat, it's hard for me to do that, the swara, the undulating, the wave, how the pundits say it. I can imagine how a Western scholar, even interested in linguistics, what is your experience with that?
Well, I never tried to pronounce the swaras. I'm told that the Marathi pronunciation, which I picked up as a result of working in Pune, is considered very good.
Yeah.
In comparison to, let's say, the Bengali or Hindi pronunciation. I believe that Hindi scholars even scholars pronouncing Sanskrit swallow a lot of the vowels and leave out some syllables and so forth. Whereas in general, the Marathi pronunciation seems to be very good.
Yeah.
Maybe also Kannada pronunciation of Sanskrit. So,
yeah, it's good. So I'm from Telugu, the Hyderabadi and the Andhra, that side. So even that has a lot of, Telugu has a lot of roots in Sanskrit. So we are pretty close to it. But yeah, thanks for spending so much time with me today. So I think, is there anything that you want to say apart from things we discussed? I know I briefly touched here and there on Panini, some about Sanskrit, some about your background. Is there something that you would say about learning Sanskrit, the benefits of it, or non-benefits, whatever you want to say?
Well, it's a beautiful language, as you said, and it pays off. Learning it pays off with a great literature as well. The poetry is magnificent, and it's given me so much pleasure. If you want to know more about Panini, there are articles on my webpage. Some of them are elementary, some are very specialized, but there's a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, I'll provide the links to the web page in the description below, so the viewers can go and read your articles. I've read some of them, and they're succinct. Some of them are succinct, some of them are very technical. The technical ones, I couldn't really get my head around it. Some of it, obviously, they were written for scholars and research people. But some of the one on Panini and linguistics was fascinating. I think everybody should read it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. So we look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Thank you so much.